How the King Held the Brigadier, by Arthur Conan Doyle. Murat was undoubtedly an excellent cavalry officer, but he had too much swagger, which spoils many a good soldier. Lasalle, too, was a very dashing leader, but he ruined himself with wine and folly. Now I, Etienne Gérard, was always totally devoid of swagger, and at the same time I was very abstemious, except maybe at the end of a campaign, or when I met an old comrade in arms. For these reasons I might perhaps, had it not been for a certain diffidence, have claimed to be the most valuable officer in my own branch of the service. It is true that I never rose to be more than a chief of brigade, but then, as everyone knows, no one had a chance of rising to the top unless he had the good fortune to be with the Emperor in his early campaigns. Except Lasalle and Lebau and Drouet, I can hardly remember any one of the generals who had not already made his name before the Egyptian business. Even I, with all my brilliant qualities, could only attain the head of my brigade. And also the Special Medal of Honor, which I received from the Emperor himself, and which I keep at home, in a leathern pouch. But though I never rose higher than this, my qualities were very well known to those who had served with me, and also to the English. After they had captured me, in the way in which I described to you the other night, they kept a very good guard over me at Oporto, and I promise you that they did not give such a formidable opponent a chance of slipping through their fingers. It was on the 10th of August that I was escorted on board the transport which was to take us to England. And behold me, before the end of the month, in the great prison which had been built for us at Dartmoor. L'Hôtel Français et Pension, we used to call it, for you understand that we were all brave men there, and that we did not lose our spirits because we were in adversity. It was only those officers who refused to give their parole who were confined at Dartmoor, and most of the prisoners were seamen, or from the ranks. You ask me perhaps why it was that I did not give this parole, and so enjoy the same good treatment as most of my brother officers. Well, I had two reasons, and both of them were sufficiently strong. In the first place, I had so much confidence in myself that I was quite convinced that I could escape. In the second, my family, though of good repute, has never been wealthy, and I could not bring myself to take anything from the small income of my mother. On the other hand, it would never do for a man like me to be outshone by the bourgeois society of an English country town, or to be without the means of showing courtesies and attentions to those ladies whom I should attract. It was for these reasons that I preferred to be buried in the dreadful prison of Dartmoor. I wish now to tell you of my adventures in England, and how far Milord Wellington's words were true when he said that his king would hold me. And first of all I may say that if it were not that I have to set off to tell you about what befell myself, I could keep you here until morning with my stories about Dartmoor itself, and about the singular things which occurred there. It was one of the very strangest places in the whole world, for there, in the middle of that great desolate waste, were herded together 7,000 or 8,000 men, warriors, you understand, men of experience and courage. Around there were a double wall and a ditch, and warders and soldiers. But my faith, you could not coop men like that up, like rabbits in a hutch. They would escape by 2s and 10s and 20s, and then the cannon would boom, and the search parties run, and we, who were left behind, would laugh and dance and shout "Vive l'Empereur!" until the warders would turn their muskets upon us in their passion. And then we would have our little mutinies too, and up would come the infantry and the guns from Plymouth, and that would set us yelling "Vive l'Empereur!" once more, as though we wished them to hear us in Paris. We had lively moments at Dartmoor, and we contrived that those who were about us should be lively also. You must know that the prisoners there had their own courts of justice, in which they tried their own cases and inflicted their own punishments. Stealing and quarrelling were punished, but most of all treachery. When I came there first, there was a man, Meunier, from Reims, who had given information of some plot to escape. Well, that night, owing to some form or other which had to be gone through, they did not take him out from among the other prisoners, and though he wept and screamed and grovelled upon the ground, they left him there, amongst the comrades whom he had betrayed. That night there was a trial with a whispered accusation and a whispered defence, a gagged prisoner, and a judge whom none could see. In the morning, when they came for their man with papers for his release, there was not as much of him left as you could put upon your thumbnail. They were ingenious people, these prisoners, and they had their own way of managing. We officers, however, lived in a separate wing, and a very singular group of people we were. They had left us our uniforms, so that there was hardly a corps which had served under Victor, or Massena, or Ney, which was not represented there, and some had been there from the time when Junot was beaten at Vimiera. We had chasseurs in their green tunics, and hussars like myself, and blue-coated dragoons, and white-fronted lancers, and voltigeurs, and grenadiers, and the men of the artillery and engineers. But the greater part were naval officers, for the English had had the better of us upon the seas. I could never understand this until I journeyed myself from Oporto to Plymouth, when I lay for 7 days upon my back, and could not have stirred had I seen the eagle of the regiment carried off before my eyes. It was in perfidious weather like this that Nelson took advantage of us. I had no sooner got into Dartmoor than I began to plan to get out again, and you can readily believe that, with wits sharpened by 12 years of warfare, it was not very long before I saw my way. You must know, in the first place, that I had a very great advantage in having some knowledge of the English language. I learned it during the months that I spent before Danzig, from Adjutant O'Brien of the Régiment Irlandais, who was sprung from the ancient kings of the country. I was quickly able to speak it with some facility, for I do not take long to master anything to which I set my mind. In 3 months I could not only express my meaning, but I could use the idioms of the people. It was O'Brien who taught me to say "Bijabers," just as we might say "ma foi," and also "the curse of Cromwell," which means ventre bleu. Many a time I have seen the English smile with pleasure when they have heard me speak so much like one of themselves. We officers were put 2 in a cell, which was very little to my taste, for my room-mate was a tall, silent man named Beaumont, of the Flying Artillery, who had been taken by the English cavalry at Astorga. It is seldom I meet a man of whom I cannot make a friend, for my disposition and manners are, as you know them, but this fellow had never a smile for my jests, nor an ear for my sorrows, but would sit looking at me with his sullen eyes, until sometimes I thought that his 2 years of captivity had driven him crazy. Ah, how I longed that old Bouvet, or any of my comrades of the hussars, was there, instead of this mummy of a man. But such as he was, I had to make the best of him, and it was very evident that no escape could be made unless he were my partner in it, for what could I possibly do without him observing me? I hinted at it, therefore, and then, by degrees, I spoke more plainly, until it seemed to me that I had prevailed upon him to share my lot. I tried the walls, and I tried the floor, and I tried the ceiling, but though I tapped and probed, they all appeared to be very thick and solid. The door was of iron, shutting with a spring lock, and provided with a small grating, through which a warder looked twice in every night. Within there were 2 beds, 2 stools, 2 washstands, nothing more. It was enough for my wants, for when had I had as much during those 12 years spent in camps? But how was I to get out? Night after night I thought of my 500 hussars, and had dreadful nightmares. in which I fancied that the whole regiment needed shoeing, or that my horses were all bloated with green fodder, or that they were foundered from bogland, or that 6 squadrons were clubbed in the presence of the Emperor. Then I could awake in a cold sweat and set to work picking and tapping at the walls once more. For I knew very well that there is no difficulty which cannot be overcome by a ready brain and a pair of cunning hands. There was a single window in our cell, which was too small to admit a child. It was further defended by a thick iron bar in the centre. It was not a very promising point of escape, as you will allow, but I became more and more convinced that our efforts must be directed towards it. To make matters worse, it only led out into the exercise yard, which was surrounded by 2 high walls. Still, as I said to my sullen comrade, it is time to talk of the Vistula when you are over the Rhine. I got a small piece of iron, therefore, from the fittings of my bed, and set to work to loosen the plaster at the top and the bottom of the bar. 3 hours I would work, and then leap into my bed upon the sound of the warder's step. Then another 3 hours, and then very often another yet. For I found that Beaumont was so slow and clumsy at it that it was on myself only that I could rely. I pictured to myself my 3rd of Hussars waiting just outside that window, with kettle-drums and standards and leopard-skin shabracks all complete. Then I would work like a madman, until my iron was crusted with blood, as if with rust. And so, night by night, I loosened that stony plaster and hid it away in the stuffing of my pillow, until the hour came when the iron shook, and then with one good wrench it came off in my hand, and my first step had been made towards freedom. You will ask me what better off I was, since, as I have said, a child could not have fitted through the opening. I will tell you, I had gained 2 things, a tool and a weapon. With the one I might loosen the stone which flanked the window. With the other I might defend myself when I had scrambled through. So now I turned my attention to that stone, and I picked and picked with the sharpened end of my bar until I had worked out the mortar all round. You understand, of course, that during the day I replaced everything in its position, and that the warder was never permitted to see a speck upon the floor. At the end of 3 weeks I had separated the stone, and had the rapture of drawing it through and seeing a hole left with 10 stars shining through it, where there had been but 4 before. All was ready for us now, and I had replaced the stone, smearing the edges of it round with a little fat and soot, so as to hide the cracks where the mortar should have been. In 3 nights the moon would be gone, and that seemed the best time for our attempt. I had now no doubt at all about getting into the yards, but I had very considerable misgivings as to how I was to get out again. It would be too humiliating, after trying here and trying there, to have to go back to my hole again in despair, or to be arrested by the guards outside, and thrown into those damp underground cells which are reserved for prisoners who are caught in escaping. I set to work, therefore, to plan what I should do. I have never, as you know, had the chance of showing what I could do as a general. Sometimes, after a glass or 2 of wine, I have found myself capable of thinking out surprising combinations, and have felt that if Napoleon had entrusted me with an army corps, things might have gone differently with him. But, however that may be, there is no doubt that in the small stratagems of war, and in that quickness of invention which is so necessary for an officer of light cavalry, I could hold my own against anyone. It was now that I had need of it, and I felt sure that it would not fail me. The inner wall which I had to scale was built of bricks, 12 feet high, with a row of iron spikes 3 inches apart upon the top. The outer I had only caught a glimpse of once or twice, when the gate of the exercise yard was open. It appeared to be about the same height, and was also spiked at the top. The space between the walls was over 20 feet, and I had reason to believe that there were no sentries there except at the gates. On the other hand, I knew that there was a line of soldiers outside. Behold the little nut, my friends, which I had to open with no crackers, save these 2 hands. One thing upon which I relied was the height of my comrade Beaumont. I have already said that he was a very tall man, 6 feet at least, and it seemed to me that if I could mount upon his shoulders and get my hands upon the spikes, I could easily scale the wall. Could I pull my big companion up after me? That was the question, for when I set forth with a comrade, even though it be one for whom I bear no affection, nothing on earth would make me abandon him. If I climbed the wall and he could not follow me, I should be compelled to return to him. He did not seem to concern himself much about it, however, so I hoped that he had confidence in his own activity. Then another very important matter was the choice of the sentry, who should be on duty in front of my window at the time of our attempt. They were changed every 2 hours to ensure their vigilance, but I, who watched them closely each night out of my window, knew that there was a great difference between them. There were some who were so keen that a rat could not cross the yard unseen, while others thought only of their own ease, and could sleep as soundly leaning upon a musket as if they were at home upon a feather bed. There was one especially, a fat, heavy man, who would retire into the shadow of the wall and doze so comfortably during his 2 hours that I have dropped pieces of plaster from my window at his very feet without his observing it. By good luck, this fellow's watch was due from 12 to 2 upon the night which we had fixed upon for our enterprise. As the last day passed, I was so filled with nervous agitation that I could not control myself, but ran ceaselessly about my cell like a mouse in a cage. Every moment I thought that the warder would detect the looseness of the bar, or that the sentry would observe the unmortared stone, which I could not conceal outside, as I did within. As for my companion, he sat brooding upon the end of the bed, looking at me in a sidelong fashion from time to time, and biting his nails like one who is deep in thought. "Courage, my friend," I cried, slapping him upon the shoulder. "You will see your guns before another month be past." "That is all very well," said he, "but whither will you fly when you get free?" "To the coast," I answered. "All comes right for a brave man, and I shall make straight for my regiment." "You are more likely to make straight for the underground cells, or for the Portsmouth hulks," said he. "A soldier takes his chances," I remarked. "It is only the poltroon who reckons always upon the worst." I raised a flush in each of his sallow cheeks at that, and I was glad of it, for it was the first sign of spirit which I had ever observed in him. For a moment he put his hand out towards his water-jug, as though he would have hurled it at me. But then he shrugged his shoulders and sat in silence once more, biting his nails and scowling down at the floor. I could not but think, as I looked at him, that perhaps I was doing the flying artillery a very bad service by bringing him back to them. I never in my life have known an evening pass as slowly as that one. Towards nightfall a wind sprang up, and as the darkness deepened it blew harder and harder, until a terrible gale was whistling over the moor. As I looked out of my window I could not catch a glimpse of a star, and the black clouds were flying low across the heavens. The rain was pouring down, and what with its hissing and splashing, and the howling and screaming of the wind, it was impossible for me to hear the steps of the sentinels. If I cannot hear them, thought I, then it is unlikely that they can hear me. And I waited with the utmost impatience until the time when the inspector should have come round for his nightly peep through our grating. Then, having peered through the darkness and seen nothing of the sentry, who was doubtless crouching in some corner out of the rain, I felt that the moment was come. I removed the bar, pulled out the stone, and motioned to my companion to pass through. "After you, Colonel," said he. "Will you not go first?" I asked. "I had rather you showed me the way." "Come after me, then, but come silently, as you value your life." In the darkness I could hear the fellow's teeth chattering, and I wondered whether a man ever had such a partner in a desperate enterprise. I seized the bar, however, and, mounting upon my stool, I thrust my head and shoulders into the hole. I had wriggled through as far as my waist, when my companion seized me suddenly by the knees and yelled at the top of his voice, "Help! Help! A prisoner is escaping!" Ah, my friends, what did I not feel at that moment? Of course I saw in an instant the game of this vile creature. Why should he risk his skin in climbing walls, when he might be sure of a free pardon from the English for having prevented the escape of one so much more distinguished than himself? I had recognized him as a poltroon and a sneak, but I had not understood the depth of baseness to which he could descend. One who has spent his life among gentlemen and men of honour does not think of such things until they happen. The blockhead did not seem to understand that he was lost more certainly than I. I writhed back in the darkness, and seizing him by the throat, I struck him twice with my iron bar. At the first blow he yelped, as a little cur does when you tread upon its paw. At the second, down he fell with a groan upon the floor. Then I seated myself upon my bed, and waited resignedly for whatever punishment my jailers might inflict upon me. But a minute passed, and yet another, with no sound save the heavy snoring, breathing of the senseless wretch upon the floor. Was it possible, then, that amid the fury of the storm his warning cries had passed unheeded? At first it was but a tiny hope. Another minute, and it was probable. Another, and it was certain. There was no sound in the corridor, none in the courtyard. I wiped the cold sweat from my brow, and asked myself what I should do next. One thing seemed certain. The man on the floor must die. If I left him, I could not tell how short a time it might be before he gave the alarm. I dare not strike a light, so I felt about in the darkness until my hand came upon something wet, which I knew to be his head. I raised my iron bar, but there was something, my friends, which prevented me from bringing it down. In the heat of fight I have slain many men of honour too, who had done me no injury. Yet here was this wretch, a creature too foul to live, who had tried to work me so great a mischief, and yet I could not bring myself to crush his skull in. Such deeds are very well for a Spanish partida, or for that matter a sans-culotte of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, but not for a soldier and a gentleman like me. However, the heavy breathing of the fellow made me hope that it might be a very long time before he recovered his senses. I gagged him, therefore, and bound him with strips of blanket to the bed, so that in his weakened condition there was good reason to think that, in any case, he might not get free before the next visit of the warder. But now again I was faced with new difficulties, for you will remember that I had relied upon his height to help me over the walls. I could have sat down and shed tears of despair, had not the thought of my mother and of the Emperor come to sustain me. "Courage," said I. "If it were anyone but Etienne Gérard, he would be in a bad fix now. That is a young man who is not so easily caught." I set to work, therefore, upon Beaumont's sheet as well as my own, and by tearing them into strips and then plaiting them together, I made a very excellent rope. This I tied securely to the centre of my iron bar, which was a little over a foot in length. Then I slipped out into the yard, where the rain was pouring and the wind screaming louder than ever. I kept in the shadow of the prison wall, but it was as black as the ace of spades, and I could not see my own hand in front of me. Unless I walked into the sentinel, I felt that I had nothing to fear from him. When I had come under the wall, I threw up my bar, and to my joy it stuck the very first time between the spikes at the top. I climbed up my rope, pulled it after me, and dropped down on the other side. Then I scaled the second wall, and was sitting astride among the spikes upon the top, when I saw something twinkle in the darkness beneath me. It was the bayonet of the sentinel below, and so close was it, the second wall being rather lower than the first, that I could easily, by leaning over, have unscrewed it from its socket. There he was, humming a tune to himself, and cuddling up against the wall to keep himself warm, little thinking that a desperate man within a few feet of him was within an ace of stabbing him to the heart with his own weapon. I was already bracing myself for the spring, when the fellow, with an oath, shouldered his musket, and I heard his steps squelching through the mud as he resumed his beat. I slipped down my rope, and, leaving it hanging, I ran at the top of my speed across the moor. Heavens, how I ran! The wind buffeted my face and buzzed in my nostrils. The rain pringled upon my skin and hissed past my ears. I stumbled into holes. I tripped over bushes. I fell among brambles. I was torn and breathless and bleeding. My tongue was like leather, my feet like lead, and my heart beating like a kettle drum. Still I ran, and I ran, and I ran. But I had not lost my head, my friends. Everything was done with a purpose. Our fugitives always made for the coast. I was determined to go inland, and the more so as I had told Beaumont the opposite. I would fly to the north, and they would seek me in the south. Perhaps you will ask me how I could tell which was which on such a night. I answer that it was by the wind. I had observed in the prison that it came from the north, and so, as long as I kept my face to it, I was going in the right direction. Well, I was rushing along in this fashion when suddenly I saw two yellow lights shining out of the darkness in front of me. I paused for a moment, uncertain what I should do. I was still in my hussar uniform, you understand, and it seemed to me that the very first thing that I should aim at was to get some dress which should not betray me. If these lights came from a cottage, it was probable enough that I might find what I wanted there. I approached, therefore, feeling very sorry that I had left my iron bar behind, for I was determined to fight to the death before I should be retaken. But very soon I found that there was no cottage there. The lights were two lamps hung upon each side of a carriage, and by their glare I saw that a broad road lay in front of me. Crouching among the bushes, I observed that there were two horses to the equipage, that a small postboy was standing at their heads, and that one of the wheels was lying in the road beside him. I can see them now, my friends, the steaming creatures, the stunted lad with his hands to their bits, and the big black coach, all shining with the rain, and balanced upon its 3 wheels. As I looked, the window was lowered, and a pretty little face under a bonnet peeped out from it. "What shall I do?" the lady cried to the postboy in a voice of despair. "Sir Charles is certainly lost, and I shall have to spend the night upon the moor." "Perhaps I can be of some assistance to madame?" said I, scrambling out from among the bushes into the glare of the lamps. A woman in distress is a sacred thing to me, and this one was beautiful. You must not forget that, although I was a colonel, I was only 28 years of age. My word, how she screamed, and how the postboy stared. You will understand that after that long race in the darkness, with my shako broken in, my face smeared with dirt, and my uniform all stained and torn with brambles, I was not entirely the sort of gentleman whom one would choose to meet in the middle of a lonely moor. Still, after the first surprise, she soon understood that I was her very humble servant, and I could even read in her pretty eyes that my manner and bearing had not failed to produce an impression upon her. "I am sorry to have startled you, madame," said I. "I chanced to overhear your remark, and I could not refrain from offering you my assistance." I bowed as I spoke. You know my bow, and can realize what its effect was upon the lady. "I am much indebted to you, sir," said she. "We have had a terrible journey since we left Tavistock. Finally, one of our wheels came off, and here we are, helpless, in the middle of the moor. My husband, Sir Charles, has gone on to get help, and I much fear that he must have lost his way." I was about to attempt some consolation when I saw beside the lady a black travelling coat, faced with astrakhan, which her companion must have left behind him. It was exactly what I needed to conceal my uniform. It is true that I felt very much like a highway robber, but then, what would you have? Necessity has no law, and I was in an enemy's country. "I presume, madame, that this is your husband's coat?" I remarked. "You will, I am sure, forgive me if I am compelled to—" I pulled it through the window as I spoke. I could not bear to see the look of surprise and fear and disgust which came over her face. "Oh, I have been mistaken in you," she cried. "You came to rob me, then, and not to help me. You have the bearing of a gentleman, and yet you steal my husband's coat." "Madame," said I beg that you will not condemn me until you know everything. It is quite necessary that I should take this coat, but if you will have the goodness to tell me who it is who is fortunate enough to be your husband, I shall see that the coat is sent back to him." Her face softened a little, though she still tried to look severe. "My husband," she answered, "is Sir Charles Meredith, and he is travelling to Dartmoor prison upon important government business. I only ask you, sir, to go upon your way, and to take nothing which belongs to him." "There is only one thing which belongs to him that I covet," said I. "And you have taken it from the carriage," she cried. "No," I answered. "It still remains there." She laughed in her frank English way. "If, instead of paying me compliments, you were to return my husband's coat," she began. "Madame," I answered, "what you ask is quite impossible. If you will allow me to come into the carriage, I will explain to you how necessary this coat is to me." Heaven knows into what foolishness I might have plunged myself had we not, at this instant, heard a faint hello in the distance, which was answered by a shout from the little postboy. In the rain and the darkness I saw a lantern some distance from us, but approaching rapidly. "I am sorry, madame, that I am forced to leave you," said I. "You can assure your husband that I shall take every care of his coat." Hurried as I was, I ventured to pause a moment to salute the lady's hand, which she snatched through the window with an admirable pretence of being offended at my presumption. Then, as the lantern was quite close to me, and the postboy seemed inclined to interfere with my flight, I tucked my precious overcoat under my arm and dashed off into the darkness. And now I set myself to the task of putting as broad a stretch of moor between the prison and myself as the remaining hours of darkness would allow. Setting my face to the wind once more, I ran until I fell from exhaustion. Then, after 5 minutes of panting among the heather, I made another start, until again my knees gave way beneath me. I was young and hard, with muscles of steel, and a frame which had been toughened by 12 years of camp and field. Thus I was able to keep up this wild flight for another 3 hours, during which I still guided myself, you understand, by keeping the wind in my face. At the end of that time I calculated that I had put nearly 20 miles between the prison and myself. Day was about to break, so I crouched down among the heather upon the top of one of those small hills which abound in that country, with the intention of hiding myself until nightfall. It was no new thing for me to sleep in the wind and the rain. So, wrapping myself up in my thick warm cloak, I soon sank into a doze. But it was not a refreshing slumber. I tossed and tumbled amid a series of vile dreams, in which everything seemed to go wrong with me. At last, I remember, I was charging an unshaken square of Hungarian grenadiers, with a single squadron upon spent horses, just as I did at Elkingen. I stood in my stirrups to shout "Vive l'Empereur!" and as I did so, there came the answering roar from my hussars, "Vive l'Empereur!" I sprang from my rough bed, with the words still ringing in my ears, and then, as I rubbed my eyes and wondered if I were mad, the same cry came again. 5,000 voices in one long-drawn yell. I looked out from my screen of brambles and saw, in the clear light of morning, the very last thing that I should either have expected or chosen. It was Dartmoor Prison. There it stretched, grim and hideous, within a furlong of me. Had I run on for a few more minutes in the dark, I should have butted my shako against the wall. I was so taken aback at the sight that I could scarcely realize what had happened. Then it all became clear to me, and I struck my head with my hands in my despair. The wind had veered from north to south during the night, and I, keeping my face always towards it, had run 10 miles out and 10 miles in, winding up where I had started. When I thought of my hurry, my falls, my mad rushing and jumping, all ending in this, it seemed so absurd that my grief changed suddenly to amusement, and I fell among the brambles and laughed until my sides were sore. Then I rolled myself up in my cloak and considered seriously what I should do. One lesson which I have learned in my roaming life, my friends, is never to call anything a misfortune until you have seen the end of it. Is not every hour a fresh point of view? In this case I soon perceived that accident had done for me as much as the most profound cunning. My guards naturally commenced their search from the place where I had taken Sir Charles Meredith's coat, and from my hiding-place I could see them hurrying along the road to that point. Not one of them ever dreamed that I could have doubled back from there, and I lay quite undisturbed in the little bush-covered cup at the summit of my knoll. The prisoners had, of course, learned of my escape, and all day exultant yells, like that which had aroused me in the morning, resounded over the moor, bearing a welcome message of sympathy and companionship to my ears. How little did they dream that on the top of that very mound, which they could see from their windows, was lying the comrade whose escape they were celebrating. As for me, I could look down upon this poor herd of idle warriors as they paced about the great exercise yard or gathered in little groups, gesticulating joyfully over my success. Once I heard a howl of execration, and I saw Beaumont, his head all covered with bandages, being led across the yard by 2 of the warders. I cannot tell you the pleasure which this sight gave me, for it proved that I had not killed him, and also that the others knew the true story of what had passed. They had all known me too well to think that I could have abandoned him. All that long day I lay behind my screen of bushes, listening to the bells which struck the hours below. My pockets were filled with bread, which I had saved out of my allowance, and on searching my borrowed overcoat, I came upon a silver flask full of excellent brandy and water, so that I was able to get through the day without hardship. The only other things in the pockets were a red silk handkerchief, a tortoise-shell snuff-box, and a blue envelope with a red seal, addressed to the Governor of Dartmoor Prison. As to the first 2, I determined to send them back when I should return the coat itself. The letter caused me more perplexity, for the governor had always shown me every courtesy, and it offended my sense of honour that I should interfere with his correspondence. I had almost made up my mind to leave it under a stone upon the roadway, within musket shot of the gate. This would guide them in their search for me, however, and so, on the whole, I saw no better way than just to carry the letter with me, in the hope that I might find some means of sending it back to him. Meanwhile, I packed it safely away in my innermost pocket. There was a warm sun to dry my clothes, and when night fell I was ready for my journey. I promise you that there were no mistakes this time. I took the stars for my guides, as every hussar should be taught to do, and I put 8 good leagues between myself and the prison. My plan now was to obtain a complete suit of clothes from the first person whom I could waylay, and I should then find my way to the north coast, where there were many smugglers and fishermen who would be ready to earn the reward which was paid by the Emperor to those who brought escaping prisoners across the Channel. I had taken the panache from my shako, so that it might escape notice, but even with my fine overcoat I feared that sooner or later my uniform would betray me. My first care must be to provide myself with a complete disguise. When day broke I saw a river upon my right and a small town upon my left, the blue smoke reeking up above the moor. I should have liked well to have entered it, because it would have interested me to see something of the customs of the English, which differ very much from those of other nations. Much as I should have wished, however, to have seen them eat their raw meat and sell their wives, it would have been dangerous until I had got rid of my uniform. My cap, my moustache, and my speech would all help to betray me. I continued to travel towards the north, therefore, looking about me continually, and never catching a glimpse of my pursuers. About midday I came to where, in a secluded valley, there stood a single small cottage, without any other building in sight. It was a neat little house, with a rustic porch and a small garden in front of it, with a swarm of cocks and hens. I lay down among the ferns and watched it, for it seemed to be exactly the kind of place where I might obtain what I wanted. My bread was finished, and I was exceedingly hungry after my long journey. I determined, therefore, to make a short reconnaissance, and then to march up to this cottage, summon it to surrender, and help myself to all that I needed. It could at least provide me with a chicken and with an omelette. My mouth watered at the thought. As I lay there, wondering who could live in this lonely place, a brisk little fellow came out through the porch, accompanied by another older man who carried 2 large clubs in his hands. These he handed to his young companion, who swung them up and down and round with extraordinary swiftness. The other, standing beside him, appeared to watch him with great attention, and occasionally to advise him. Finally he took a rope and began skipping, like a girl, the other still gravely observing him. As you may think, I was utterly puzzled as to what these people could be, and could only surmise that the one was a doctor and the other a patient who had submitted himself to some singular method of treatment. Well, as I lay watching and wondering, the older man brought out a greatcoat, and held it while the other put it on, and buttoned it to his chin. The day was a warmish one, so that this proceeding amazed me even more than the other. At least, thought I, it is evident that his exercise is over. But far from this being so, the man began to run, in spite of his heavy coat, and as it chanced, he came right over the moor in my direction. His companion had re-entered the house, so that this arrangement suited me admirably. I would take the small man's clothing and hurry on to some village where I could buy provisions. The chickens were certainly tempting, but still there were at least 2 men in the house, so perhaps it would be wiser for me, since I had no arms, to keep away from it. I lay quietly then among the ferns. Presently I heard the steps of the runner, and there he was quite close to me, with his huge coat, and the perspiration running down his face. He seemed to be a very solid man, but small, so small that I feared that his clothes might be of little use to me. When I jumped out upon him, he stopped running, and looked at me in the greatest astonishment. "Blow my dicky," said he. "Give it a name, governor. Is it a circus or what?" That was how he talked, though I cannot pretend to tell you what he meant by it. "You will excuse me, sir," said I, "but I am under the necessity of asking you to give me your clothes." "Give you what?" he cried. "Your clothes." "Well, if this don't lick cockfighting," said he, "what am I to give you my clothes for?" "Because I need them." "And suppose I won't?" "Bejabers," said I shall have no choice but to take them." He stood with his hands in the pockets of his greatcoat. and a most amused smile upon his square-jawed, clean-shaven face. "You'll take 'em, will you?" said he. "You're a very leery cove by the look of you, but I can tell that you've got the wrong sow by the ear this time. I know who you are. You're a runaway Frenchy from the prison yonder, as anyone could tell with half an eye. But you don't know who I am, else you wouldn't try such a plant as that. Why, man, I'm the Bristol bustler, 9-stone champion, and them's my training quarters down yonder." He stared at me as if this announcement of his would have crushed me to the earth, but I smiled at him in my turn, and looked him up and down with a twirl of my moustache. "You may be a very brave man, sir," said I, "but when I tell you that you are opposed to Colonel Etienne Gérard of the Hussars of Conflans, you will see the necessity of giving up your clothes without further parley." "Look here, Mounseer, drop it," he cried. "This'll end by your getting pepper." "Your clothes, sir, this instant," I shouted, advancing fiercely upon him. For answer he threw off his heavy greatcoat and stood in a singular attitude, with one arm out and the other across his chest, looking at me with a curious smile. For myself, I knew nothing of the methods of fighting which these people have, but on horse or on foot, with arms or without them, I am always ready to take my own part. You understand that a soldier cannot always choose his own methods, and that it is time to howl when you are living among wolves. I rushed at him, therefore, with a warlike shout, and kicked him with both my feet. At the same moment my heels flew into the air. I saw as many flashes as at Austerlitz, and the back of my head came down with a crash upon a stone. After that I can remember nothing more. When I came to myself, I was lying upon a truckle bed in a bare, half-furnished room. My head was ringing like a bell, and when I put up my hand there was a lump like a walnut over one of my eyes. My nose was full of a pungent smell, and I soon found that a strip of paper soaked in vinegar was fastened across my brow. At the other end of the room this terrible little man was sitting with his knee bare, and his elderly companion was rubbing it with some liniment. The latter seemed to be in the worst of tempers, and he kept up a continual scolding, which the other listened to with a gloomy face. "Never heard tell of such a thing in my life," he was saying. "Been training for a month, with all the weight of it on my shoulders, and then when I get you fit as a trout, and within 2 days of fighting the likeliest man on the list, you let yourself into a by-battle with a foreigner." There, stow your gab," said the other sulkily. "You're a very good trainer, Jim, but you'd be better with less jaw." "I should think it was time to jaw," the elderly man answered. "If this knee don't get well before next Wednesday, they'll have it that you fought a cross. And a pretty job you'll have next time you look for a backer." "Fought a cross," growled the other. "I've won 19 battles, and no man ever so much as dared to say the word cross in my hearing. How the deuce was I to get out of it, when the cove wanted the very clothes off my back? Tut, man, you knew that the beak and the guards were within a mile of you. You could have set them on to him, as well then as now. You'd have got your clothes back again, all right." "Well, strike me," said the bustler. "I don't often break my training, but when it comes to giving up my clothes to a Frenchie who couldn't hit a dint in a pat of butter, why, it's more than I can swallow. Per man, what are the clothes worth? Do you know that Lord Ruffton alone has £5,000 on you? When you jump the ropes on Wednesday, you'll carry every penny of 50,000 into the ring. A pretty thing to turn up with a swollen knee, and a story about a Frenchman." "I never thought he'd a kicked," said the bustler. "I suppose you expected he'd fight Broughton's rules, and strict PR? Why, you silly, they don't know what fighting is in France." "My friends," said I, sitting up on my bed, "I do not understand very much of what you say, but when you speak like that, it is foolishness. We know so much about fighting in France. that we have paid our little visit to nearly every capital in Europe, and very soon we are coming to London. But we fight like soldiers, you understand, and not like gamins in the gutter. You strike me on the head, I kick you on the knee. It is child's play. But if you will give me a sword and take another one, I will show you how we fight over the water." They both stared at me in their solid English way. "Well, I'm glad you're not dead, Mounseer," said the elder one at last. "There wasn't much sign of life in you when the bustler and me carried you down. That head of yours ain't thick enough to stop the crook of the hardest hitter in Bristol." "He's a game cove too, and he came for me like a bantam," said the other, still rubbing his knee. "I got me old left right in, and he went over as if he had been poleaxed. It wasn't my fault, Mounseer. I told you you'd get pepper if you went on." "Well, it's something to say all your life that you've been handled by the finest lightweight in England," said the older man, looking at me with an expression of congratulation upon his face. "You've had him at his best, too, in the pink of condition, and trained by Jim Hunter." "I am used to hard knocks," said I, unbuttoning my tunic and showing my 2 musket wounds. Then I bared my ankle also, and showed the place in my eye where the guerrilla had stabbed me. "He can take his gruel," said the bustler. "What a glutton he'd have made for the middleweights," remarked the trainer. "With 6 months' coaching, he'd astonish the fancy. It's a pity he's got to go back to prison." I did not like that last remark at all. I buttoned up my coat and rose from the bed. "I must ask you to let me continue my journey," said I. "There's no help for it, Mounseer," the trainer answered. "It's a hard thing to send such a man as you back to such a place. But business is business, and there's a £20 reward. They were here this morning looking for you, and I expect they'll be round again." His words turned my heart to lead. "Surely you will not betray me," I cried. "I will send you twice £20 on the day that I set foot upon France. I swear it, upon the honour of a French gentleman." But I only got headshakes for a reply. I pleaded, I argued, I spoke of the English hospitality and the fellowship of brave men, but I might as well have been addressing the 2 great wooden clubs which stood balanced upon the floor in front of me. There was no sign of sympathy upon their bull faces. "Business is business, Mounseer," the old trainer repeated. "Besides, how am I to put the bustler into the ring on Wednesday if he's jugged by the beak for aiding and abetting a prisoner of war? I've got to look after the bustler, and I take no risks." This, then, was the end of all my struggles and strivings. I was to be led back again like a poor silly sheep who has broken through the hurdles. They little knew me who could fancy that I should submit to such a fate. I had heard enough to tell me where the weak point of these 2 men was, and I showed, as I have often showed before, that Etienne Gérard is never so terrible as when all hope seems to have deserted him. With a single spring I seized one of the clubs and swung it over the head of the bustler. "Come what may," I cried, "you shall be spoiled for Wednesday." The fellow growled out an oath, and would have sprung at me, but the other flung his arms round him and pinned him to the chair. "Not if I know it, bustler," he screamed. "None of your games while I am by. Get away out of this, Frenchy. We only want to see your back. Run away, or he'll get loose." It was good advice, I thought, and I ran to the door. But as I came out into the open air, my head swam round, and I had to lean against the porch to save myself from falling. Consider all that I had been through, the anxiety of my escape, the long useless flight in the storm, the day spent amid wet ferns, with only bread for food, the second journey by night, and now the injuries which I had received in attempting to deprive the little man of his clothes. Was it wonderful that even I should reach the limits of my endurance? I stood there in my heavy coat, and my poor battered shako, my chin upon my chest, and my eyelids over my eyes. I had done my best, and I could do no more. It was the sound of horses' hoofs which made me at last raise my head. And there was the grey-moustached governor of Dartmoor prison, not 10 paces in front of me, with 6 mounted warders behind him. "So, Colonel," said he, with a bitter smile, "we have found you once more." When a brave man has done his utmost and has failed, he shows his breeding by the manner in which he accepts his defeat. For me, I took the letter which I had in my pocket, and stepping forward, I handed it with such grace of manner as I could summon to the governor. "It has been my misfortune, sir, to detain one of your letters," said I. He looked at me in amazement and beckoned to the warders to arrest me. Then he broke the seal of the letter. I saw a curious expression come over his face as he read it. "This must be the letter which Sir Charles Meredith lost," said he. "It was in the pocket of his coat. You have carried it for 2 days?" "Since the night before last." "And never looked at the contents?" I showed him by my manner that he had committed an indiscretion in asking a question which one gentleman should not have put to another. To my surprise, he burst out into a roar of laughter. "Colonel," said he, wiping the tears from his eyes, "you have really given both yourself and us a great deal of unnecessary trouble. Allow me to read the letter which you carried with you in your flight." And this was what I heard. "On receipt of this, you are directed to release Colonel Etienne Gerard of the 3rd Hussars, who has been exchanged against Colonel Mason of the Horse Artillery, now in Verdun." As he read it, he laughed again, and the warders laughed, and the 2 men from the cottage laughed. And then, as I heard this universal merriment, and thought of all my hopes and fears, and my struggles and dangers, what could a debonair soldier do but lean against the porch once more, and laugh as heartily as any of them? And of them all, was it not I who had the best reason to laugh? Since in front of me I could see my dear France, and my mother, and the Emperor and my horsemen, while behind me lay the gloomy prison and the heavy hand of the English king. That is the end of How the King Held the Brigadier, from The Exploits of Etienne Gerard, by Arthur Conan Doyle. Read by Greg Wagland, for Magpie Audio, 2024. Thank you for listening.